Everybody, welcome to our weekly live stream. And today I'm Gary Sandling, and I'm here with John Ragosta, who is a historian here at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, where we are. And John is a scholar of religion in early America. And we've been talking about this topic off and on for a long time, haven't we, John?
Yeah, for a number of years.
That's
Started
right.
with my dissertation.
That's right. So John came to the center as a fellow in 2008. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
We did a podcast about that work, which is still online. You can listen to it, about the role dissenters played in making religious freedom, the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, become the law of Virginia. And the book is called Wellspring of Liberty, right?
That's true. That's
Yep.
correct.
Okay, good. And over my time here, part of my job has been to help train tour guides. And one of the things we talk a lot about is how to talk about religion. And the public, constitutional, statutory dimensions of this are often the thing that we read about in the news, right?
Right. And I think that misses something that you and I have talked about that's critical. When we think about this issue in Jefferson, we think about separation of church and state and a wall of separation, and all that's critically important. We can talk about that. But what I think people miss is that for Jefferson, just like those religious dissenters, there's a theological aspect. There's a religious aspect that we know politics drive him for separation of church and state. The oceans of blood have been spilled. We know philosophy drives him to separation of church and state. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But what historians, and I think many in the public miss, he also had a religious reason to support separation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so what we hope to do today is talk about a few moments in Jefferson's life where he says something about what he believes and to some degree why he believes it, and how that helps inform that very, very deeply held belief on Jefferson's part, right? That religion is solely a matter between a person and their creator. It's a matter between God and an individual, and that there should be no intervention in that exploration, really, especially not the state. So let's talk a little bit about then some of those examples of his own thinking. Do you have one that, we talked about this yesterday.
Yeah.
I have a little list. You probably have some. Share something that you think is important.
Well, I want to jump back on something you just said, which you were paraphrasing Jefferson, I know intentionally, but for the audience.
Right.
He often talks about, my religion is between myself and my God. My religion is something personal. And historians tend to read that as a statement about privacy. Leave me alone. I don't want to talk about it.
Right.
But I think it's really religious, that the critical thing happening in religion, or one of the critical things happening in religion in the 18th century, especially among the evangelical dissenters, is the idea you have to have a personal relationship to God.
Mm-hmm.
No priest, no bishop, no pope intervening, no mediation, no government intervening.
Right.
And so when Jefferson says things like, my religion is I'm not going to talk about it. Of course, he talks about it a lot, but he says, I'm not going to talk about it because my religion is between me and my God. That's partially a theological statement.
Yeah, and of course, we'll be specific. We're talking about Protestant Christians, evangelical Christians in what becomes the United States, which are a variety of religious denominations that have successors today, groups like the Baptists, like the Presbyterians. So those movements were, the growth of those groups, very strong on the eve of the Revolution. And Jefferson, after the Declaration of Independence, right, in 1776, as soon as all of that is wrapped up, he gets himself back to Virginia, right? And he actually will sit in that first session of the General Assembly that meets after independence, right? And what are some of the things they do?
And that's that's interesting for several reasons. He comes back, so he writes the Declaration of Independence, a little thing. The Continental Congress adopts that. He rushes back to Virginia, and he's back in the new General Assembly because there's a new constitution for Virginia as an independent state. And he's immediately put on the Committee for Religion, which, by the way, is where he meets James Madison for the first time.
That's right.
And he and Madison's cooperation, we know that Madison and Jefferson cooperate, obviously, throughout their lives. On the issue of religion and religious freedom, they are absolutely very, very tight.
They aren't on everything. They aren't on a lot of things, but they were on that.
Right. We can talk about a lot of things where they disagree, but on religion and religious freedom, they're absolutely foursquare. So on that committee in 1776, the question comes up immediately because in the colony, his king's, old dominion, we have an official religion. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, and the question is, how does that operate now that Virginia is an independent nation? And so this is what happens throughout the Revolutionary War, but it starts in December of 1776 when the committee on which Jefferson and Madison served suspend the church tax and start the process. It's going to take 10 years, right, but start the process of separating church from state. And what surprises people, which is what you were alluding to with these Protestant dissenters, is here are these evangelical dissenters, Presbyterians and Baptists primarily, some Lutherans, some Quakers, but deeply religious evangelical dissenters. And they are absolutely aligned with Jefferson and Madison, who today, we don't see that kind of alignment today. And people now think of Jefferson's separation of church and state as somehow being anti-religious or anti-religion. They didn't understand it that way. They understood it as being foursquare with their religious beliefs.
And so if we fast forward then, 10 years later, basically, or almost 10 years later, when the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom is passed, the statute itself, the wording of it, is very clear about the idea that there can be not only are all Virginians free to have whatever religious beliefs they hold, they're free to not have them. They're free to not support or not attend. The statute is very explicit about this, yes, to not support or not attend any church as well. Right. And some of that, I think, might have to, at least to some degree for Jefferson, his own religious views are ones that don't really line up exactly with any of the denominations that we'd be thinking of then, right? He doesn't check the box on kind of the articles of belief. Right. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, he says that clearly. I mean, first of all, your point's a very good one for Jefferson, and he's very clear about this. The freedom to believe is meaningless if you don't have the freedom not to believe.
Right.
And again, critical issue today that people need to think about. If you want to talk about freedom of religion, you must have the freedom to be an atheist. Otherwise, there's no freedom of religion. But Jefferson has these very idiosyncratic religious beliefs. And he says this on multiple times. At one point, he's asked to help somebody become a priest in the Anglican Church. And he says, I'm probably not the right person to write the bishop and urge you to join the priesthood.
Right. You have to nominate someone essentially to a bishop at that point, right? And
he says, I'm not, nobody's going to want my name on that. But at another time, and this is a fascinating episode, he's approached by a family friend to be a godfather in the christening of a child. Now, and I've done this. I don't know, you've done this. You do this when somebody comes and asks you to be a godparent for their child. But Jefferson says, no, I can't do that because I can't subscribe to the Articles of Faith of the Episcopal Church. And we could talk about specifically why he can't subscribe. But just stop on that point for a moment. You have to be deeply, devoutly religious to make that statement. Because you say, sure, you're going to do it for a family friend. You have to stand up, right, and the priest sprinkles water on the child's head and everybody's happy and goes to the party. Jefferson says, I cannot do that because I'm not willing to stand up in church and do that.
He writes back this family friend and says the difficulty of reconciling the ideas of unity and Trinity have, from a very early part of my life, excluded me from the office of sponsorship, from serving as a godparent, essentially. And I found that for me, that's a really interesting observation. It's the first time in his correspondence, at least according to the editors of his correspondence, right, that anyone sees, that he ever says anything quite like that. And at this point, it's 1788, Jefferson's 45 years old. And these views, he's basically saying, I'm not sure I can really say I believe this. Right. And he says that in a letter, and he says it to a friend. But it does give you an insight into, his views, which often get lumped into kind of this category. People always want to put the religious views of people in a box.
Yes.
I need it to fit a category. And the category that you hear people say most often is deist. And there's some quibbling with that, and we don't have to get in necessarily into that quibbling right now, at least for historians, theologians, there's quibbling with that. But this idea that I believe in God, but I don't necessarily believe in all the teachings of Christianity, right? He's sort of sending a little signal there about what he believes.
Right, and again, you're raising an important point about this comes up as he grows. As a child, Jefferson appears to be pretty standard Anglican, and as a young man, but his views, and we tend to think of Jefferson like this, he's a statue and he's frozen in time. But as with you or I or most people, his views develop over time and change some. But clearly he's evolving his views, and he spends a lot of time thinking about religion and thinking about these issues. But he's evolving, as you say, to a non-traditional view, because and the quote you just read, he rejects the Trinity, he rejects the resurrection, he rejects Jesus' divinity. He says, he has every human excellence. He thinks Jesus is the greatest philosopher of all time.
Yeah.
But you also said something important, that when you start listing those things, people can tend to get their backs up. He also is deeply, devoutly a believer in God. And that's consistent.
Yeah, I think it is. It's one, but like a lot of people, his views, sometimes the glimpses you get change over time, right? But like you say, here it is sort of in midlife when he's in France, he expresses this view. About the same time, he writes, I think, a letter to his, or not I think, he did write a letter to his nephew, Peter Carr, where he says in the letter, and sorry, I'm fishing around just to make sure I don't get the quotes wrong, because somebody watching will know the quote. They'll call me on it, and they should. But he writes this. This letter.
It's a great letter.
He writes this advice letter. So he writes this advice letter to his nephew, and it's about the kind of coursework he should be doing while studying with George Wythe, right? So George Wythe, Williamsburg jurist, one of the foremost legal minds of the early Commonwealth of Virginia, the colony of Virginia, Jefferson's own law tutor. From about 20 years prior to this letter. So he's telling him, here's how I think you should set your course of study, right? And he lines out several things, but he gets to religion, and he says here a quote that is often taken, an excerpt of which is often taken out, but he says, "Fix reason firmly in her seat when thinking about religion, and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God. Because if there is one, he must approve of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear," which is kind of a long-winded, educated way in the 18th century of saying you should use your judgment about what you're taught, right? And you should draw conclusions of your own based on reason that tell you about what to believe or what not to believe.
And the other part of that quote, and draw in all of these sources, all of these things you have available. Jefferson becomes a major advocate of comparative religion, or a student, perhaps is a better term, a student of comparative religion. So Jefferson, for example, buys his Quran in 1765. People, sometimes you hear somebody saying, well, he owned the Quran because he wanted to know his enemy in the Barbary Pirates War. That's just silly. He bought the Quran in 1765 when he was a student studying law and religion, and he was interested in comparative law because Sharia law was important, but he's also interested in comparative religion. And he comes back to that then in the next decade, in the 1790s, when he's in communication with Joseph Priestley, one of the great Unitarians, and they're studying the question of Greek religions and the Catholic religion and the Jewish religion. And he asks, I want to see you, Priestley, come up with this comparison.
Right.
And so Jefferson wants, and he's saying to his nephew, his favorite nephew, call all these sources in, read them, think about them. Now, having done that, Jefferson ends up with a view which, again, you mentioned labels. When somebody tries to tie me down, I said, if I had to pick a label, I'd say Unitarian. But Unitarian is a very broad category.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And these kinds of things get revealed over time. And I think the 1790s, for a lot of reasons, are really interesting for this reason, because Jefferson comes back from France. Of course, he's in Washington's government, the Secretary of State, which he resigns from, after essentially 4 years. And he begins to be affiliated with a faction in the government that has a different point of view about a lot of policy issues than, say, Washington himself or Hamilton or others who become known as the Federalists, right? So it's a little premature to talk about political parties here, but he's the leader of what becomes certainly an opposition to some of these policies. And he's attacked, right? He's attacked in the press for being pro-French. And if you favor the French Revolution, particularly in its radical stages, of being an atheist, because some of the more radical French revolutionaries did reject, abolish the Catholic Church. So it was easy to kind of label Jefferson as an atheist. And then the gloves really come off in 1796, right? And I've talked about those elections before too, right, on an earlier live stream. But one of the ways the gloves came off is that he's painted as an atheist. There's kind of a moment here where Jefferson obviously he's not going to tell people, well, here's what I really believe, because he knows it'll be used as a weapon. But it is a period where some of his friends and someone like Joseph Priestley and others began to say, well, help us understand what you do believe. He's kind of pressed a little bit, about this by this point in his career.
Right,
privately.
And he has to think himself. I mean, as you point out, that one of the things that gets him in real trouble politically is the quote from Notes in the State of Virginia that whether there's one God or 20 gods or no God, if my neighbor believes there's one God, 20 gods, or no God, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So basically, it's none of my business, is what he's saying. But people take that no God and say, oh, Jefferson's an atheist, and that's used against him. And he writes to Priestley, he says, it's a libel against me to suggest that I want a government without religion, or I want a world without religion.
Right.
He wants no government officially involved in religion. And so he grapples with this, and that a lot of it occurs during his presidency. And Jefferson, I've written an article about Jefferson's presidency and the issue of religious freedom, because it starts with, well, first of all, it starts with John Leland, the great Baptist minister, showing up with a 1,500-pound cheese because to give Jefferson, because Jefferson, or Leland, this great Baptist evangelical, honors, and his supporters, Baptist supporters, honor Jefferson because of his support of separation of church and state. Now, that in itself is interesting. Leland knows that Jefferson's views are heterodox from a theological perspective. He knows that Jefferson doesn't agree with him on religion, but he says, we agree on religious freedom.
Right.
And so I'm going to honor you, even though we have grave, again, message for today, even though we have grave disagreements on religion. But Jefferson's grappling with this. And so, Leland shows up, I think it's January 1st, 1802, with the mammoth cheese, six foot around cheese. And it's January 2nd when Jefferson issues the Danbury Baptist letter, in which he talks about the Constitution creates a wall of separation between church and state. And I say Jefferson's grappling with this because he actually has communications back and forth with Gallatin, Albert Gallatin, his Secretary of Treasury, about what does a government official do with their political beliefs and their religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. He's focused on their political beliefs in the correspondence with Gallatin, but he's having the same inquiry about religious beliefs, because we know that government officials are going to still have political views, and they can right. vote, and they can campaign, and they can go to a political campaign. But he and Gallatin agree they cannot use their official position to support the political campaign. It's like an early version of the Hatch Act, which unfortunately has been ignored much. Right. And the same idea on religion. Of course, government officials are going to have religious views, and their religion will affect their views on legislation, their views on how government should operate. But they can't use their government position for religious purposes. So the example I always give, which again is so powerful, Jefferson says in 1808, when he's asked to issue an official prayer proclamation because the nation is facing a crisis, what will end up being the War of 1812, and Samuel Miller, Presbyterian minister, writes him and says, issue a prayer proclamation. We need to pray, invoke God's blessing on our nation as we face this crisis. Jefferson writes back, says, I can't do it, violation of the Constitution. I know that there would be no penalty if people didn't pray, but if I, the President of the United States, issue an official proclamation saying we're going to pray on this day, we know those people who don't aren't good Americans. We know there's an implication. But here's the thing. Jefferson prays in both of his inaugural addresses publicly.
Say a little bit about that.
So in both of the 1801 inaugural address and the 1805 inaugural address, he concludes, now he's not talking about Jesus, he would not do that because that's not, but he talks about the ruler of the universe, may he bless our nation and bless my efforts. So what's the difference? And the way I sum it up is an official can pray, even publicly, but cannot pray officially. And that's what Jefferson is doing. When he's giving his inaugural address, it's a personal statement. It's just like a political candidate today is making a speech and begins or ends with a prayer or mentions their own religious beliefs.
Invokes somehow. And this is related, I think, to his idea about it really is a matter of conscience. So if your conscience compels you to sort of talk about this, and there's some let's look at some questions. Sure. It's a little, because some are coming in, and I'm going to take these in the order that our team. So sorry if I'm looking at my phone, all of you out there. It's just this is how I get the questions. And there's a question here about, did Jefferson observe any Catholic services in Paris, or do you make any comments on the atmosphere inside the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals there? Yeah, so
that's a great question.
It's a great question.
And I don't have a particularly specific as to in Paris, but Jefferson does go to Catholic services, as do during the Revolution. Right. Most of the leaders, Adams, Washington, they go to Catholic services.
Because Philadelphia is one of the few places in America where you could find Pennsylvania, which had the most, let's say, most tolerant religious policies as a colony. Right. Was the one place they would find.
There's a Catholic church. And so Jefferson and Adams says very similar things. They're very uncomfortable with Catholicism. And Jefferson says some things that are very unkind to Catholics. And when his daughter implies that she might become a nun, he immediately pulls her out of the nunnery school.
That's right. She went, so everybody, just in case, so we're all on the same page, when Jefferson was in Paris, his oldest daughter attended a school called Pentamont, which was run by nuns. It was a convent school in Paris. A lot of diplomats' children went there. Right. But she did say something to him to this effect. And sorry, what did he do?
He pulls her out of the school. Yeah. Now, again, the view was she probably just wanted to get out of the school, and so she knew what would jerk her dad's cord. But
I never thought of that, but yeah, okay.
But he understands that even though I have disagreements with these Catholics, even though I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and mumbo jumbo, he wouldn't use that phrase, they still deserve absolute religious freedom.
Right.
So in his autobiography, he talks about the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, the infidel of every nation. So he believes Catholics should have complete religious freedom, and that becomes an issue after the Louisiana Purchase, because he writes a letter to the nuns in New Orleans, and who are concerned that now we're going to be part of the United States. We know the United States doesn't have a state religion, and he writes a letter and he says, "You just keep doing what you're doing. It's none of our business in the government."
And, I think to go back to this idea about how Jefferson's own views inform a lot of this, it really is his, he over time, he does a couple of things that I think they're done very privately to sort of help articulate his own understanding that show, I think, his belief that he should not have to feel his own belief should not be subject to coercion by either the state or by other people. Yeah. And so I want to mention, the thing that's probably best known is twice, actually. Jefferson does this twice, but one copy survives. He takes the Gospels and he goes through the Gospels and he cuts out, he takes 4 versions of the Gospels of the New Testament, one in Greek, one in French, or one in Greek, one in Latin, one in French, and one in English. And he kind of he cuts out the parts that he thinks are Jesus's true teachings, right? And he takes everything else out. He takes out miracles. Yeah. He takes out the resurrection. He takes out the things that he thinks were layered in later, but he thinks them, as you said earlier, the moral teachings of Jesus. Right. He says, later in life, he says, these are the most important, or the most important system of morality right?
Right, and so for example, what's referred to as the Jefferson Bible, it ends with the stone being rolled in front of the tomb. There is no resurrection because Jesus is the greatest human philosopher, but not divine for Jefferson. But you're raising another point. He says, and this is interesting when people talk about his religious views, at one point he refers to his views as Christianism, because he says Christianity is the best religion for a republic. Which is an interesting statement for Jefferson to make. Now, we're not going to force you to have it. The government can't encourage it. You have to come to the decision yourself, which is one of the critical elements in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It's only what your own mind and your own relationship with God is the only true religion. But he says Christianity, I think, is the best for a republic. But what people often leave out is why. And he makes it clear the reason he believes that is because Christianity teaches not only love your neighbor, but love your enemy. And so in a country which is going to have a very diverse ethnic, religious, we know today racial, he wouldn't necessarily have thought that immediately, but a very diverse populace, he says, look, we're going to have a lot of disagreements. And in our country, we've got to understand that we're all Americans. We all support the nation, even in the face of those very violent disagreements. So it's love your enemy. Is why he so much honors Christianity and Jesus, because, as you say, it's sort of a Sermon on the Mount kind of Jesus for Jefferson. His ethical views, his moral views. Jefferson says he's the greatest philosopher of all time.
That's right. And I think there's where, and of course, but let's point out, he doesn't say this publicly.
No.
He doesn't write an article, he doesn't write a book. He writes an outline, and he prepares this particular scripture, this set of scriptures, for his own, as he says, moral contemplation. And the reason I'm holding the book, the Smithsonian, who has the copy, the original, has made a really good facsimile version of it, which you can find widely, and it's the exact shape and form of his book. Let's look at a few more questions, because there's a couple more came in. This one is more, so a question you hear talked about a lot. Did Jefferson want to ban religion from the public square? We use this term public square a lot now in this debate. You've literally written books on these kinds of topics. What's your thought about that?
I mean, it can be, and I'm not saying the questioner is, but so many people engage in a semantic game. What do you mean by public square?
Right.
Again, it's back to, I think, this prayer in his inaugural address versus a prayer proclamation, that if by public square you just mean out in public, no.
We got one right. We got a little one right. It's an online public square.
We're a private organization.
We got one.
We could say whatever we want about religion. Right. We're a private organization. So he does not want to ban it from the public square, in the sense that if you want to, and in fact, after we get a Jeffersonian separation of church and state, keep in mind that we have an explosion of religions. That's when we get the Disciples of Christ and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and the Oneidians. Because once the public square no longer has government control, you have a free market for religion, it explodes. Jefferson didn't necessarily like that result, but he understood that was the result that was going to occur.
Right.
When Jefferson says, or when people say, well, Jefferson was keeping religion out of the public square, out of the government official square. Again, he understood that government officials would be religious. Again, an example I use is, if the president walks out of the White House on a Friday evening, and he's a Jewish president, let's say, and he says, I'm going to synagogue. There's a scrum of reporters, and he says, I'm going to synagogue. You all have a nice weekend. He can do that. If the president walks out of the White House and he has a press release on White House letterhead and says, here is our press release saying everybody should go to synagogue tonight, and I hope all of you Americans do, so that's what we good Americans do. That's different.
Gets a little iffy.
And now there are going to be times when it's going to be hard to define, okay, where does that public square get to be government public square versus where is it private public square? But that distinction is critical to Jefferson. So no.
And like a lot of questions about the kind of framework of government we have, nobody, this wasn't settled then, and it's not settled now. It's something that we continue to kind of revisit.
Try to figure it out.
Yeah. So another question, thank you, by the way, for these questions, everybody. We appreciate it. So would it be fair to say, unlike Paine, Thomas Paine, who hated all religions, Jefferson saw truth and falsehoods in all religions? Any thought about that?
I think it's a fair observation. I mean, he one of the things he says, and now that question makes me think about it, again, in his study of comparative religion, he makes it clear. He says, look, all religions agree on the basic moral and ethical elements. You don't lie, you don't cheat, you don't kill people, you don't steal. And he says, this is universal among religions. He says, what religions fight over is dogmas. And that's when he talks about the oceans of blood are spilled over these dogmas. And so, yes, he sees good and bad. And so he says, at one point, he says, if I had to pick a name for my own religion, he says, I would call it apiarianism, because like the honeybee, I take the nectar from each flower that's sweet. So he sees good elements in every religion, but he views dogmas. Another example, he gets into an argument with John Adams about spiritualism versus materialism.
Yes.
And he finally says, well, I'm a materialist, but I could be wrong, and I rest my head on the pillow of ignorance, which a benevolent God has made so soft, knowing that we're going to have to use it so often.
Yes.
So he says, let's not argue about those dogmas, since we all agree on the basic moral and ethical teachings.
I'm glad you brought that quote up, because I think some of the most interesting things that Jefferson has to say about religion is when he and Adams discuss it.
Yes.
And Jefferson seems much more willing. It's always Jefferson, I feel like, who's sort of leading the conversation on this topic. And certainly I would encourage anyone, who can, to look at that correspondence. But that quote is a very telling one, because it also shows Jefferson's willing to say there's a lot here. There's limits to human knowledge, and there's kind of limits to what I know. And he was willing to sort of to not sort of have to take up some spirited defense of one position or another in a situation where he said, here's what I think.
Right.
But he didn't feel like he had to sort of then cudgel Adams into holding the same point.
And I may be wrong. I mean, he says,
I
I may be wrong, and it doesn't matter. These are the kinds of things that don't matter.
Yeah. There's one other question. I want to make sure we catch this one as well. That did Jefferson view a relation between religion and morality?
Yes, although it's difficult. There's a syllogism, which I think is often misused, is that religion promotes morality, morality promotes good government in the 18th century, and that very universal. So religion promotes morality, morality promotes good government. And what people say is, so therefore we need religion to promote government.
Right.
And Madison and Jefferson were very clear, no. So that breaks down, or we ought to have government promoting religion, because it becomes this circle that religion will then promote government. And Madison says more about this, but Jefferson also talks about it. He says, no, as soon as government starts trying to promote religion, it's impure.
And it uses the apparatus. It uses the coercive mechanisms of the state,
which destroys.
Just destroys any claim to
virtue
or to moral. At least that's the argument they both use in 1776.
Right,
and they cite the Roman Empire, right, as the example.
Right. So they see that relationship, but again, they make it very clear it has to be a private relationship. So Jefferson, for example, when he's in retirement here at Monticello, he goes to church. He believes in church just much like Benjamin Franklin, as a social institution that is good for the community, because everybody gets together and everybody understands they're part of a community. So there's no church here in Charlottesville at the time, and they would use the courthouse just much like we'll see schools used today on a Sunday when they're not being used for other purposes.
That's right.
And one week it would be Methodist, and the next week it'd be Baptist, and then it'd be Presbyterian, and then it'd be Anglican. Well, Jefferson would go to any of them.
He loved it.
Yeah.
Right? This was an example. This is worth talking about for a second, because you want to get a sense in his retirement of what he thought was the greatest embodiment of religious freedom. The greatest embodiment, but like a practical example of the fruits of this idea of full religious freedom was that these four denominations, none of them had a church proper in Charlottesville. There were churches near Charlottesville of all these denominations, but in town. And so, at least until very late in Jefferson's life, in the Episcopal Church, and so they just they took turns at the courthouse, and he would go down there from time to time and go to any of it. Like he made a point of attending. He wasn't there every Sunday, to be sure, or at least I would hazard, but he certainly was there with regularity.
Right. And very Franklin-esque. Benjamin Franklin does the same thing. Both Jefferson and Franklin contribute to multiple religions and multiple religious societies, because they believe there's a social value to community to have people understand those things. So again, he's not willing to stand up and be a godparent,
Right.
but he's willing to go to the church.
But he shows up. Yeah, he shows
up.
up. And certainly he maintained relationships with members of clergy
Clergy,
from a
absolutely.
variety of denominations. I think that's right. I mean, his notion is one where if freedom of conscience in a broad sense is allowed to be exercised, then you have a flourishing of belief. You have a flourishing of different groups. And Jefferson thought you'd have to use your own judgment to decide which, if any, of these you wanted to be part of.
Right, and one of his great mistakes, I mean, he's not a great prognosticator. He says that over time, everybody in America is going to become Unitarian. Right. Because that's the rational religion to him. You know, Jesus is not divine, but he's a great philosopher, and so we're all going to become Unitarian. Of course, that doesn't happen. As I mentioned before, instead what we have is the Second Great Awakening, this explosion of religion, which looking back on, it's easy to say after the fact, that's what happens when you have a free market for religion. You get all of these options. But I do think Jefferson and Madison, even though they don't necessarily agree with all of those religions, say, look, that's America. That's
right.
You know.
And I think I sort of want to close on this idea, which Jefferson, you mentioned earlier. He alludes to this in 1821 when he's looking back on the Virginia legislature passing his statute of Virginia for religious freedom, right? And he talks about there was a moment in debate where someone wanted to put the words Jesus Christ in the statute. It's not there anywhere, and it wasn't there in his draft. He talks about the holy author of our religion, but it doesn't specify who the holy author is. And there had been
or what our religion is.
Or what our religion is. And there had been a moment that someone wanted to insert the words Jesus Christ. And he says the insertion was rejected by a great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, and Mohammedan, so Muslim, not a term we would use today, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. I'm not sure that everyone in the legislature of Virginia at the time meant that that's what it would include, but he certainly did. And clearly enough of them realized any insertion like that would be deeply problematic to the notion of religious liberty.
Right, and I mean, there's two interesting things. One he points out in his autobiography, which is what you're reading from, that it's rejected by a large majority.
Right.
So even though they wouldn't necessarily have used the terms of Jefferson, they had the idea that no, we have to be open. The other thing that I think is fascinating about that quote is, look, there's not a lot of Hindus in 18th century Virginia, okay? So he does see that America will be a melting pot, a 19th century term, but he does see these people will come. We will be a nation of multi-religions, and that's why government cannot get involved in religion, and religion can't control government, because we have to have a government that's going to work for all of the people. Right. And so again, that reference, the same with the reference to Muslims. Now we do have a number of slaves who are raised.
There are definitely enslaved people in America who bring with them Muslim religious
the Islamic
practices.
tradition.
Absolutely.
But I don't think that's what he's talking about. And I think the use of the Hindu is critical, because there's not any Hindus in 18th century Virginia. But he's saying this is America.
It's meant to encompass as wide a group of people as you could possibly. I always imagine it as it's meant to be the Big Tent. It's meant to encompass as widely as possible.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks, John. I think this, I've really enjoyed doing this, and at least an opportunity to talk about some of these less explored areas. And we thank everybody who's tuned in. So we hope you have a good weekend. Thanks.
Thanks.